It is a wonderful pleasure to be joined by Shai Davidai. I hope I pronounced your first and last name correctly. He is the Assistant Professor
Yes.
of Management at the Columbia Business School. Shai, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And all things considered, I'm doing okay. Some people have it much tougher than I do.
Yes, of course. We'll go into detail about that
Yeah.
because in this hour we are discussing an article in which you co-authored with your wife, I presume,
Yeah.
Yarden Greenspan.
Yes.
Um, it is titled "What Happens When You Teach at Columbia and Reject Hamas." So
Yes.
this article has a lot to do with October the 7th and its aftermath. But as an overview, tell us about the fields of teaching and research in which you're conducting at Columbia right now.
Yeah. So I am trained as a social psychologist. Social psychology, for those who don't know, is involved with how the real presence or the imagined presence of others affects our behaviors, our emotions, our thought processes. Um, about 5 years ago, I moved to Columbia Business School, joined the Columbia Business School as a behavioral scientist, where I teach negotiations and I study various psychological issues related to things like economic inequality, economic mobility, conflict, and conflict resolution. Um, so try to understand how people perceive our worlds and what do they do about it.
So I wonder, so how long has it been since you first entered Columbia?
So I joined in 2019, so almost 5 years.
Okay. So I wonder, during that time before October the 7th, 2023, has, say, either your Jewish identity or your views regarding the state of Israel ever hampered your teaching at the school at all?
That is a great question, and the answer is absolutely not. I mean, I've always been open about who I am and what I am. With a name like Shai Davidai, with an accent like myself, I can't hide my Israeliness. I would never want to hide it, but it's just not something that ever came up. Um, I assume that some people agree with me with my views, some people disagree with my views, and it's always been a non-issue because disagreement is part of democracy. Disagreement is part of academia. Um, so until October 7th, while it's been always been a part of my identity, it's never been something that people define me by. So I can define myself how I want, but nobody looked at Shai and said, that's the Jew, that's the Zionist. Things have changed since October 7th, obviously.
Mhm. I understand that the events of, I suppose, April or May of 2021, where Hamas fired an array of rockets onto Israeli soil, in some ways, it was a prelude to what happened here in 2023. So, well, was the reaction on campus regarding some people who were anti-Israel at that time, did it alarm you at all during 2021?
I've been trying to think about that because that's a great observation. I don't remember being especially alarmed back then. I think partially it was still like at the height of COVID for us. And, a lot of things in the world didn't make sense. And, people were protesting crazy things. They were protesting vaccines, they were protesting schools. They were like, I think it just, for me personally, it was not a big issue at the time. I mean, I was personally affected by it, with my having my family hide in bomb shelters all around Israel, all my friends being in bomb shelters. Um, but it wasn't the thing that really resonated with people here so much. And again, you know, the people that did protest or did say something online, it felt like an ideological difference, right? It felt like some people say X, other people say Y. and it's fine. We should have that exchange. It's very different from what we're seeing now, which is it's not an ideological difference. It really is a difference in, do you accept the other side's willingness to exist, right to exist, right? Whereas I accept Palestinians' right to exist, and I think there should be a Palestinian state. But the people on the other side say Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Jews don't have a right to exist here. You, Shai, don't have a right to exist as a Zionist. That's the difference between what we had before October 7th and what we have now.
Mhm. So where were you that day?
On October 7th. So for us in New York, it started on the Friday, October 6th. It was late at night. My wife and I had Shabbat dinner. We are secular atheists, but we have like a traditional Shabbat dinner every week. We were done like cleaning the house, washing the dishes. And right before we went to bed, we kind of like opened our phones and we saw that my sister-in-law sent a picture of her one-year-old son standing in front of the TV, and there's something that says something like Hamas terrorists infiltrate Israel or something like that. So we immediately opened the news, and slowly as the news was coming in, we realized like this is something different. 3,000 rocket shots in a few hours. Hundreds, now we know thousands of Hamas terrorists inside of Israel's borders. It was a very difficult thing. So I just stayed up all night watching the news and getting updates from Israel.
Mhm. Yes. For me, I found out about it in the morning of the 7th because of the time zone that we have here.
Mhm.
I could tell that Israel is heading for a prolonged struggle. I didn't know about the hostages or the massacres of
Yeah.
civilians at that time, but I know that a war will come. And this event comes at, I should say, two anniversaries of Israeli history. One is the 75th anniversary of Israel's founding, 1948 till 2023, and two, the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, which took place in 1973, and incidentally, around the time of October, around the
Right.
time of the Jewish Day of Repentance, Yom Kippur. So both occasions in 73 as well as 2023, it took place in the Sabbath, the day of Jewish rest. So I wonder, in your view, did the terrorists who struck Israel at this year, were they aware of both the fact that it was a Sabbath day, and two, it was the 50th year of probably Israel's most traumatic war experience?
Wow, that's a very insightful and interesting question. I must tell you, one thing that we have to remember, it wasn't just a Shabbat, a Saturday, it was also the last day of our Sukkot holiday.
Mm.
So it was a very special day. It's basically the day where the Jewish people around the world finish reading the Bible. And the next day they start reading the Bible from Genesis, from the first chapter. Again, I'm not a religious person. I don't read the Bible on a daily basis, but it's part of our people. I think, I don't know, and I think people from intelligence have a better say, but it doesn't look accidental. Hamas terrorists targeted the celebrations at the Nova Music Festival, which they knew happens on the religious holiday on the Shabbat. They targeted the military bases and the kibbutzim, the villages around the border, because they knew that on Saturday the security is a little bit more lax than on the other days. They knew that people are more likely to be at home rather than at work, so it's easier to maximize the number of people that you kill. So it was no accident that they did it on that. Were they aware of the fact that it's 50 years after the Yom Kippur War? I'm not sure. But that's part of symbolism. Sometimes other people are so blinded with hatred that they don't realize that their hatred symbolizes something bigger, right? When you think about 9/11 in the United States, were the terrorists aware that 9/11, translates to like 911, how they probably were not, but the symbolism of it was so clear to everyone, everyone targeted by the hatred. So I do think that even if they didn't intend it this way to be on the 50th anniversary, it had the same effect.
Mhm. And of course, since the 7th was on a Monday, sorry, on a Saturday, but the 9th was on a Monday. So when you returned to campus on the 9th, was there anything that you find particularly shocking regarding the reaction to what happened in Israel on the 7th?
So I did not return to campus until the 12th.
Oh, okay.
I, as an Israeli and a Jew, I was grieving. It's hard to explain to anyone outside of Israel how big this is. Um, it's not just in the sheer numbers, but in the connectedness, the interconnectedness of the country. That everybody knows someone who was somehow affected by this. Everyone either has a friend or a family member or knows someone who has a friend or a family member that either was murdered or kidnapped or tortured, people that were recruited for reserve duty. Like, it's just such a small country. So I was very shocked, and I only went onto campus on October 12th, and that's to see a pro-Hamas protest, one of the first basically pro-Hamas protests on campus. And what I saw there shocked me. I saw hundreds of students celebrating Hamas, celebrating rapes, celebrating murder. And there come times in every person's life where what you see in front of your eyes doesn't fit any of the schemas that you have in your mind. You think that reality is one way, and then you realize that reality is another way. And that was the moment for me. I thought the reality was there's disagreements, but we're all in a civil society. And I realized that this is not a disagreement. This is hate and anti-Semitism and an uncivil society. That was a moment of shock for me.
Um, Allow me to repeat that. A protest signaling the support for a known terrorist group and consisting of mass murderers in the campus of one of America's most prestigious universities. What are some of the, I suppose, details that you noticed that you find unnerving in that protest?
There are several things that were very unnerving. One is the joy. It's just pure joy. When you see how people react to massacre, like the massacre that we saw on October 7th, and all the hostages, many of them are still being held in Gaza. In my mind, there are two ways to react. You can either grieve, like almost every Jewish person on the planet, and many non-Jewish people that were just shocked by the sheer horror of it, or you can be indifferent. There are many tragedies in the world, and some people are just they're saturated and very indifferent. I never imagined that I would see a third reaction, which is joy. The students were happy. They were celebrating, they were singing, they were chanting. That was the first thing. The second thing was that I was shocked by was the rhetoric. So, the things that now have become we're so used to, but like screams from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Or when they sing it in Arabic, Palestine will be Arab. Um, we don't want two states. We want all of 48. There is only one solution: Intifada revolution. Intifada meaning a bloody campaign of suicide bombings and stabbings and shootings. That shocked me. The third thing that really unnerved me was the symbolism, the symbols they were using, right? This was not a protest using American symbols. This was a protest using fundamentalist religious extremist symbolism. So you saw everyone draped in keffiyehs, just like you see people in the Taliban and in Hamas and in Hezbollah and in ISIS. You saw many flags, but they were only either Palestinian flags or other terror organization of Hamas flags or other terror organization flags. You did not see American flags, right? You saw that the symbolism was one of aligning with the terror organization, right? Using words like our martyrs, right? A martyr, a shaheed, is a person that dies in action fighting against the infidels. In this case, the infidel being the Jew. When they say our martyrs, they're basically saying, we are fighting against you, the infidels. For me, that's just all of this is just unnerving. It's things that I am used to from the Middle East. I grew up with this. I've seen this like in happening in the West Bank. I've seen it happening in Gaza. I've seen it happening in Lebanon. Obviously, I've seen it in the news happening in the Taliban and ISIS. I've never imagined this would happen in New York City.
Let's transport back to Israel and Gaza for a moment. So my age is currently 24. I'm turning 25 this year. So 2005 was when Israel withdrew from the Strip, and 2007 was when Hamas was elected. So I was respectively 6 and 8 years old when that happens. So I would imagine that 6 to 8 year olds living in the Strip at that time, when they were governed by Hamas, they were, well, miseducated and I suppose indoctrinated by such hatred and such evil that many of them would try to commit this massacre. And when I try to imagine myself being one of the people who may have been raised by that ideology at that time, I drew a blank because I could not imagine the degree to which someone can be seep into this this evil, this wickedness. And I'm not sure if you can do a better job trying to sketch out the mind of, say, someone who's in Hamas. If so, you're welcome to enlighten me, because boy, I cannot.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Their hatred doesn't come out of nowhere. You need to be indoctrinated towards hatred, right? And we've seen the educational books for second graders and fourth graders and sixth graders, and how the Israeli and the Jew are being demonized, even like in math class. If a shaheed kills this amount of Jews one day and then this amount the other day, how much did he kill in total? Teaching math, but actually indoctrinating hatred. And we see that this wasn't just happening by Hamas; it was also happening by UNRWA, the specific UN organization for the Palestinian refugees. So this was paid for by US and EU money. That's an important thing. At the same time, we have to remember that most Palestinians are not members of Hamas. Most Palestinians are opposed. If you ask them personally and anonymously, and they feel safe to tell you the truth, are opposed to Hamas, probably. So indoctrinating hatred is not enough to lead someone to engage in these such brutal attacks. What I think the additional thing that Hamas does is indoctrinating hatred on the one hand, but also indoctrinating a religious fundamentalist point of view. We have to remember, Hamas is unlike the Fatah in the West Bank. Hamas is a religious terrorist organization, not a secular terrorist organization. For them, it's a religious fight. Their charter draws from the religious documents. And it's kind of like the Crusades that were happening in the 13th and 12th century. So I cannot put myself in the mind of someone who would go and rape innocent civilians, murder babies, kidnap old women. I just can't put myself in the mind of that person. I can put myself in the mind of a innocent Palestinian civilian who was spoon-fed hatred throughout their lives and is now realizing what that hatred means and being confused and not sure who's the right person, who's the good one, who's the bad one here. But I can't, it's hard for me, like you said, like it's hard for me to understand someone in the Hamas.
And I wonder, assuming that you are somewhat of the left-leaning liberal fold of, I guess, a political affiliation, has this event, as well as the response from, I guess, the people of your camp or the extremist wing of your camp, does that make you reconsider your progressive allegiances at all?
Yes and no. I'll tell you, and I'll start with the yes. It makes me reconsider the labels. It makes me reconsider what does it mean when you call yourself a progressive or a liberal or a Democrat or whatever it is. I'm reconsidering that because I had an assumption of the people in my camp and thinking that I know what they believe in. And then looking left and right and realizing that the people that I thought were aligned with me in my camp are actually not aligned with me, they are against me. So I'm reconsidering that. At the same time, I am not reconsidering my values. And that's the important thing. My values have remained unchanged throughout all of this. You know, my basic values that everyone is equal, that everyone deserves equal rights and equal protection, that no civilian should be targeted in any war. Like those things are fundamentals. That's not something that you can change. That's something about being a human for me. It's my humanity. I will not reconsider that. That's not part, no one can take that away from me. What frustrates me is to see other people in my progressive camp who I thought were feminists, like myself. And I find out, no, they're only feminists, but they care more about, you know, supporting Hamas than about supporting Israeli women. The people that I thought were in favor of LGBTQ rights. And I thought we're in the same fight. And I realized, no, they care more about supporting terror, even though the terror organization murders and executes LGBTQ individuals. I look around and I see people that care about minority rights. And I realize, oh, they don't really care about minority rights because when it comes to Jewish rights, which is one of the smallest ethnic minorities in the United States and obviously in the world, they could care less about us. So for me, it's more about how do I reclaim and keep the label and show the world that those other people, they are not really left wing. They are not liberal, they are illiberal. They are not progressive, they are regressive. How do I make that clear? Because my values have not changed and will not change.
That's completely understandable. Now, in regards to the personal safety as well as the, I guess, security of workplace when it comes to you and your wife, how is that situation working out?
When all of this started, my wife and I had a conversation where we decided that the issue at stake here is more important than any specific self-interest that we may or may not have. And when we made that decision, we agreed on that even if this means that I will lose my job, this is the right fight to fight. Because there comes a moment in every person's life where they are faced with something bigger than themselves. And they have to make a decision. Do I fight for what's right? Or do I preserve my own tiny bubble of comfort in the world? And I found myself in that point a few days after October 7th, and I decided that the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, is to fight for what's right, even if it means that this will completely burst my bubble of comfort. And it has. In many, many ways, my career has been jeopardized, my professional ties have been jeopardized. I love my job. I want to stay at my job, but it's not the most important thing. I would rather be unemployed and fighting against evil than have a good job and remain silent.
Now, as a man of faith, I'm a Catholic Christian. I would like to offer my prayers to you and your wife for your safety as well as your security. So I certainly
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you know, one of the things that are interesting to me is how these events of October 7th in the last 4 months have led to people joining in despite all of our disagreements. And part of the disagreements is religious disagreements, right? And you can see Orthodox Jews and non-Jews, conservative and modern and atheists like myself, all joining in together because we're realizing all of those differences are somewhat superficial. Humanity is, the underlying humanity is what unites us. So, it really touches me when someone, like yourself would come and like, let's discuss this issue.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear it. So, as a man with faith in God, I believe that there will be times when you are tested by God. So I suppose October the 7th is a test of, for me at least, moral resolve, whether you are clear in who are the good guys and who are the bad guys here. And I suppose in the environments of Colombia, many people have failed that test. They have equated the Israeli state with evil and Hamas as a force for good. But before getting further into that, I'd like to delve into the phrase "the right to exist," which is a very peculiar phrase. There's certainly the fact of existence. I know that I exist, and I know that you exist, and I know that the Jewish people exist. You cannot really will them out of existence by saying that I don't think they exist. But the right to exist is very potent, and these days is mostly invoked when it comes to the state of Israel. And it shows the extent to which Israelis cannot take that right for granted. Like even after they found the state 75 years later, they still have to invoke that right to exist. And right now, I think that is more needed than ever. So I wonder, what does that say about how should I put this? Why is it that in terms of Israel, in terms of the right to exist, only the state of Israel has to invoke it constantly, whereas myself, a Vietnamese, do not have to say that Vietnam has the right to exist, or typical Hungarians say we have the right to exist as Hungarians.
It, to understand the issue of the right to exist, you need to understand a little bit about the history of anti-Semitism. And I'm not going to belabor you with all the history, but you can see that throughout history, the world, different areas in the world, has questioned Jews' right to exist, right? So famously in Spain, in the 14th and 15th century, the question was, do Jews have a right to exist as a separate religion? And that's when there was a big push to convert people to either Christianity or when the Moors were there to Islam, right? That's where you get the conversos, the people the Jews that converted to Catholicism or other religions. Then came the Queen of Spain passing laws saying that even if you converted from Judaism to, let's say, Christianity, you still do not have equal rights in terms of the jobs you are able to get. And your existence in the sphere, the public sphere, is not guaranteed. And if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, that's what it was. Like in Nazi Germany, it was about, do Jews have a right to exist in terms of living? And do Jews have the right to exist in Europe? And the push was to eliminate the Jews from Europe, and those that remain in Europe, to kill them, right? And then when that question has now translated itself to, does Israel have a right to exist, right? So it's become from the Jewish identity to Jewish lives to Israel. And you're right, it's the only country in the world that has to keep explaining why it has a right to exist. And right now, it's also the only country in the world fighting for its existence. Now, some people might say that the power asymmetry between Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Hezbollah, or Israel and Houthis is so large that they are not threatening, they're not a credible threat to Israel's existence at the moment. When people say that, I ask them, but even if they're not a credible threat, meaning that Israel will exist even despite these attacks, should there be attempts to annihilate Israel? That's the question, not whether Israel will exist, but whether Israel should exist. Because no other country existence is being questioned right now. So it's a not normal question. It's not a normal question that you have to explain yourself. You have a right to exist. I have a right to exist. But at no point in your life do you walk around telling people, hi, my name is Yun, I have a right to exist. Like, unfortunately, Jews have to do that.
Mhm. Of course, let's go back to the topic of people who failed God's moral tests. So you've mentioned the agency of the United Nations, the Rescue and Works, I believe. The abbreviation is, of course, UNRWA.
Yeah.
I think that and other human rights organizations, I'm thinking of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, all three of these agencies have proclaimed themselves to stand by certain values, human rights being one of them. And time again, because of their disregard for the human rights of Israelis, they have perfectly trampled on the mantle of human rights in which they are fighting for. I wonder if this is a sign of willful ignorance, or is it based on a motivation to truly delegitimize the country, which in itself is, stems from wickedness.
I cannot talk about amnesty so much because I don't know a lot, and I try not to pontificate on issues that I am not at least somewhat well read on. I can talk about UNRWA. UNRWA, in a way, has not failed its mission. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. UNRWA was set as a agency that is supposed to delegitimize Israel's existence. Now, that's a harsh claim. So let me explain what I mean by that. The UN has two organizations, two arms to deal with refugees in the world. There are many refugees. There are Syrian refugees. There are refugees in India and Pakistan. There's refugees in Southeast Asia. There's refugees in South America. There's refugees everywhere. So the UN has an arm to deal with all the world's refugees, and it has a second arm to deal specifically with the Palestinian refugees. And the reason that's important is because the general refugee arm of the UN has one mandate, and that's to take the refugees and help them, create a new life for themselves in wherever they are, wherever they go. The UNRWA, its mandate is different. It's to keep people as refugees and to not rehabilitate themselves somewhere else in order to allow them to go back and fight against Israel's existence and keep that refugee mindset. So in a way, UNRWA is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's forcing people into refugee status, even though it's not their parents or not even their grandparents, but their great-grandparents were the actual refugees. And you can see like the people that they hire. UNRWA has hundreds and hundreds of people in its payroll who either actively participated in October 7th massacre or have been active in Hamas in different ways, hiding weapons, helping Hamas militants move from one area to the other. There's a horrible video released last week of two UNRWA individuals kidnapping a dead body of a civilian Israeli. Everyone was shocked. I am not shocked because that is exactly what UNRWA is supposed to do, to legitimize Israel. Unfortunately, the UN thinks it's helping the Palestinian refugees, but it's actually hurting them by forcing onto them this refugee status.
Oh. Of course, my reading of the history of Israel shows that it is a rather generous country towards refugees. The first Israeli generation of leaders were refugees from respectively Europe and Russia. There are Soviet refugees, the most notable one of them being Natan Sharansky. And of course, being a Vietnamese, I can recount a story where Menachem Begin admitted hundreds of refugees from Vietnam fleeing the newly reunified communist regime. Americans call them the boat people, into Israeli soil. And of course, the admissions of Ethiopian Jews. But nevertheless, I think the issue of the original refugees from the land that is now the state of Israel, who are Arabs, they numbered around 700,000 to 800,000. I think it's a moral concern for all Israelis. And in conjunction with thinking about a future Palestinian state, which I am in favor of, and I assume that you would be in favor of too, I think that issue has also has to be addressed. So is the legitimate criticism of the Rescue and Works Agency, which I share, I wonder, does that come with also with the consideration that there should be a just solution to the 47, 48 refugees of Arab descent?
Yeah, I think there should be a solution, but uh, I am more concerned with peaceful solutions, but with just solutions.
Hmm.
Now, not that I think justice is an extremely important value, but justice is subjective. What is just for you may be unjust for someone else. Peaceful is not subjective. Things are either peaceful or unpeaceful. Now, I'm also a pragmatic person. When we call someone a refugee, that means that someone has, had to escape their land that they were born in, that they have been in generations, maybe because of war, because of famine, because of political persecution, whatever it is. When you look at 1948, almost the entire population of what we call Palestinian refugees were not part of this, refugee exodus of 1947, 1948. They are the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. And then we ask ourselves, does someone whose great-grandparent escaped a certain area have more rights to that area than someone who has been born there and has lived there for 5 or 6 generations? And that's where we get to the question of what is the justice here? And there's no clear answer. So what we need to think of is what is the pragmatic, peaceful answer here? And the truth is, you will not, it's not a viable solution to have hundreds and thousands of Palestinians come back and live in Jaffa, or in Acres, Akko, or in Safed, Tzfat, or in Western Jerusalem, or Haifa. It will completely jeopardize any peaceful solution. Because where would the people that are living there, where will they go? So I don't think that the 1948 crisis will be resolved that way. But what can be resolved and what should be resolved is allowing the Palestinian an opportunity for self-determination and a Palestinian state in the land. Now, how that state will look like, how it will be governed, where in the land, all of those things are open questions that I don't have a clear answer to. I don't think that anyone has a clear answer to. But I think that should be the basis of any conversation. Allowing for Palestinian self-determination and allowing for Jewish self-determination, understanding that there are 2 people on the land and both of them have a right to exist.
Now, going back to your workplace, so the people who join in this pro-Hamas protests, I wonder, is there utter lack of moral regard for Israeli lives stems from either their own, does it stem from their own conviction, or is it a product of their teachings by certain professors that whose classes that they sit in?
It's a mixture of several things. One is the classes they sit in. The ideologues that disguise themselves as academics, and all they do is indoctrinate the students. Joseph Mossad, Rashid Khalidi, Professor Catherine Franke, all of these people they pretend to be academics. They talk about, in academic ways and in complex jargon, but they're really indoctrination. They're really trying to push an ideology on their students. And that's not all of it, right? We know that people are affected by their environment. Right now, it's social media. They choose certain doubtable sources to inform themselves. We know that people are affected by their peer groups. They, sometimes they go, and there's so many documentations of that. They go into a protest, they chant different things when they're asked very simple questions about their chants. What does intifada mean? Can you tell me how many Israeli civilians died in the second intifada? Can you tell me the years of the intifada? They have no idea, right? When they chant in Arabic, they don't speak Arabic. I would never chant in any language, no matter what the language is, if I don't speak it, because I like to know what I am shouting when I'm shouting at people. I try not to shout at people, but when I do, I want to be aware of what I'm saying. So there's a lot of willful ignorance going on. Partially it's because of the indoctrination, but partly it's because these are not children. These are 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old people that choose to be ignorant in order to feed their hatred, to feed their what they think is activism.
Now, there's a slogan which I've seen written in placards and signs in this pro-Palestine and I suppose pro-Hamas protests around the globe. That is globalize the Intifada. Of course, from our mutual reading of Israeli history, that word means a terrible time for Israelis. Many innocent civilians lost their lives, both in the first and the second. And I sort of think about how this cause of Palestine national liberation, whatever form that is taking right now, has begun to form into a global movement, and that global movement has a lot to do with decolonization ideology, and one should say it straight away, anti-Western ideology. So for these young Colombian minds, Israel has now come to represent the West, and the West is representative of domination and subjugation. And I wonder, how can that particular connection be severed, so to speak? Like Israel is not really Western, even though it can be pro-West, is Middle Eastern. Yeah?
What we're seeing now is an alignment of interests between two groups. On the one hand, we see a extremist, radical religious group that is anti-Western. And the actors are Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran. They are joined by other anti-Western groups that are not religious, but have the same goal of bringing the West down to its knees, which is Putin in Russia, Kim Jong-un in North Korea. So those are like the big anti-Western agents. At the same time, you see from the extreme left in the US, in the UK, in other European countries, people that have become so anti-Western that they are willing to give up their values of liberalism, humanity, decency, to join these extreme religious agents to fight against the West. Now, why are they doing that is a very interesting question. I think I have an idea, but I'm not sure. And I think what's happening is this. It started off with a good idea that the West has done a lot of negative things in its history. The history of the British Empire, which, by the way, Israel was colonized by the British as well as all the other countries around. The history of the British Empire, the history of US imperialism, of Dutch imperialism in the 18th and 19th century, of French imperialism, like of Southeast Asia, but also of North Africa. That history is fraught. There's a lot of issues with that. what a rational person does when they deal with a problematic issue is try to correct for it. You take history, you try to correct for it. What an irrational person does, and this is what we see from the extreme left, is completely destroy something because you don't like parts of it, right? If you and I, are friends, and I don't like part of your identity for some reason, or part of your behavior, I'll talk with you. I try to change you. You try to change me, I'll try to change you. But what they are doing is saying, well, if I don't agree with part of your past, you should not exist. You should die. That's what they're saying. So the anti-Western sentiment that we're seeing now from the extreme, from the terrorists on the one hand, and from the terrorist sympathizers on the other hand, is really some misguided view that this is justice. But this is not justice. This is the opposite of justice, right? They don't want America to be better. They want America to not be. They don't want Israel to do better. They want Israel to not exist. That's the problem.
Now, this is one question to end on. I think the response to October the 7th by the terrorist sympathizers, let's call them that way, have signified that we've reached a point of no return when it comes to, certain currents of ideas that have been flourishing on the U.S. campuses for way too long. And the congressional hearings with the three presidents of the major universities right now, as of right now, I think two of them have resigned from their posts. Claudine Gay of Harvard and I believe Liz McGill from UPenn.
Yeah.
This has the point of no return being that there are certain ideas which whose existence on campus, I think, are numbered. This doesn't mean that we should resort to illiberal ways to drive them out the campus halls, but they should be viewed with extreme caution. And of course, the stream of ideas I'm referring to is diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Now, what do you suppose are some of the ways in which that idea can be rooted out?
Wait, so let me ask a clarification question. So what exactly is the idea that you believe needs to be rooted out?
Oh, sorry. The strand of ideas known as DEI, and I believe it. Yeah.
So I think at its core, the idea of DEI is a good idea that should remain on campus. It's the idea that every group deserves to be represented on campus, deserves to be treated equally on campus, and to feel included on campus. That's a good idea. In its core, it's a beautiful idea. The way it's in practice is the problem, not the idea. The practice where there's no focus on inclusion at all. And there's only focus on diversifying a certain aspect of the university, treating some groups as worthy of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but other groups like the Jews as unworthy of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the problem. The double standard in which the good idea of DEI has been applied to society is where we have a big issue. So universities have failed the Jewish minority, and I assume other minorities might feel similarly, but I can't speak to other minorities. But the university have failed the Jewish minority by completely disregarding their inclusion, our inclusion, on campus. So while the idea of DEI is good, the way it's been put into practice has been not just unproductive, but in many ways harmful.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Shai Davidai of Columbia University, for joining this program.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it was great to talking about this, and I think we should all be having more conversations rather than shouting matches.
Agreed. And since we're talking on Friday, Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much. Shabbat shalom, and and a good weekend for you as well.